Okay, welcome back. Today is our second lecture on week 4. So we'll be returning to this question of the period before the Iron Age superpowers, mostly the Assyrians and the Persians. And our question and our focus today is small states and big ideas in the Iron Age. And specifically, how is it that relatively small states, in fact, very small states, like Israel and the Phoenicians, how is it that these relatively small states, like Israel, could have such a disproportionately large influence on world history? So the Hebrews, through their monotheistic religion, which was the first in history to assert that the God cared about how humans treated each other rather than just how humans treated the God. I mean, that is definitely what's revolutionary about Hebrew monotheism. The Hebrew God cares not only about how much humans honor the gods, but how humans treat each other, in addition to honoring God. So how is it that these small states could have such a large influence on world history? Well, as we said before, it's the decline of the Bronze Age powers, primarily Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The decline of the Bronze Age powers created a power vacuum in their former empires. Okay, these areas had formerly been in the Egyptian Empire, so it allowed these small independent states to flourish. And this was before the period in which the Assyrians emerged as the next major empire. So it created this window from about the 12th to 9th century BCE in which these remarkable small independent states can flourish. Okay, so first, so we already essentially discussed the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are very significant because they gave the Western world an alphabet. They were the first to use an alphabetic system based on letters rather than syllabic symbols. And we also know that they were very advanced traders, trading their luxury goods around the shores of the Mediterranean and possibly around the coast of northern Africa as well. But our main topic today will be discussing Hebrew monotheism and how the Hebrew state comes under the snares of the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. Again, empires that are using the new Iron Age weapons and technology. Okay, so the Hebrew origins. Like in Egypt, we know that Hebrew monotheism did not emerge all at once, and it evolved gradually out of polytheism. You see very clearly in the Hebrew Bible there is talk of the Hebrews worshiping other gods than Canaanite gods. So Hebrew monotheism doesn't all emerge at once, and the story of the Hebrews is rooted in Mesopotamia. There are many similarities between the Mesopotamian creation story, the flood story, and the Garden of Eden story. And that's because the Hebrews originally come from Mesopotamia. The story of the Hebrews begins with the emigration of Abraham's father, Terah, and his large family in Ur from Mesopotamia. We know Ur already. From Ur to a location in Syria called Haran. Okay, this is Abraham's father. So Abraham is told by God, according to the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis, to leave your relatives, leave your father's home, for the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. We call this the covenant, and I'll explain that a little bit more in just a second. But at this point, Abraham responds by moving from Syria to the land of Canaan. Okay, and Abraham there has a son very late in life, Isaac, with his wife Sarah. And in Canaan, Abraham would enter into a covenant with God. And with this covenant of God, the promise was that the land of Canaan would belong to his descendants. So the covenant of God, very important idea. It's like a contract in which Abraham promised to honor Yahweh above all other gods and promised to honor Yahweh above all all other gods, and in return, he and his family would be taken into protection by God. This was a revolutionary way of thinking about God because, again, this God was benevolent and cared for the Jews and favored the Jews above other people. And as I said before, Hebrew monotheism placed an emphasis on how the Hebrews treated each other, not only how they treated the God. So in return for this, honoring Yahweh above other gods, Abraham and his descendants would be given great favor by God. We think it is unlikely that Abraham was a complete monotheist. Clearly, he thought that the God of Abraham was important, but he did not deny existence of other gods outright. This system we call henotheism, in which there is one sort of more important God, but it doesn't outright deny the existence of others. So Abraham is a man who follows his faith and his own inner vision. So he has a son Isaac. Isaac has a son called Jacob, and Jacob has in fact 12 sons. And these 12 sons, these 12 patriarchs, became the leaders of the 12 Hebrew tribes. So these were the basis of the Jewish people. And again, it's based on this idea of the agreement between the Hebrews and God, Yahweh, that they would honor Yahweh to the exclusion of other gods. Now, what happens is that Joseph, who is one of Jacob's sons, according to the Hebrew Bible, during a famine in the land of Canaan, Joseph led the people into Egypt to escape this famine. Okay, so this is the story that we have from the Hebrew Bible. The biblical description of this flight of the Hebrews to Egypt is complicated. It's complicated by archaeological evidence. The biblical description of this movement tells us of a mass exodus of Abraham's descendants, but there is archaeological evidence which gives us a more complex picture. And it certainly doesn't disprove what's in the Bible, it just gives a more complex picture. It may have been that some Israelites went down to Egypt at the time of the Hyksos and may have been expelled with them. We do know the majority of the Israelites became subjects of Egypt during the New Kingdom Empire because, according to this story, Joseph leading the people out of the famine into Egypt, they would have been enslaved. And absolutely, although we know under Amarna there was a brief respite of slavery simply because Akhenaten is letting all of the borders down and just focusing on religion. There may have been a brief respite of slavery during the period of Akhenaten, and some of the Hebrews may have resettled in central Palestine. But definitely with Ramses II's attempts to reestablish the Egyptian Empire, these people, had they resettled in the land of Canaan, they would have been re-enslaved. So essentially what the picture of archaeological evidence suggests is that the movement of the Jews from the land of Canaan into Egypt and back is a bit more complicated than what's in the Hebrew Bible. And again, it's not my point here to prove or disprove that, just mention to you evidence that's there. But according to the traditional story that is in the Hebrew Bible, what happened is after the Jews wander into Egypt, after they're enslaved in the New Kingdom, a Hebrew who is in service of the Egyptian bureaucracy called Moses leads the people, leads the Hebrews out of Egypt. okay, into freedom. So here we see a possible date and a possible root of this Hebrew exodus. We call this movement of the Hebrews out of Egypt the Exodus. Now there, once again, in the wilderness, in the Sinai desert, once again, Moses renewed this covenant between God and the Hebrew nation. Okay, and this is where Moses received the Ten Commandments. So Moses had vowed to lead his people to the promised land, but to do so, he first, when the Hebrews were still in Egypt, he threatened the Pharaoh with a series of plagues, and culminating in the death of all firstborn sons in Egypt. After 40 or 50 years of wandering, the Hebrews reached the promised land of Canaan, and where they waged a war against the Canaanite princes. Famously, the city of Jericho was defeated by Joshua, who caused its walls to come tumbling down. Now, after this conquest of Canaan, which may have been about 1300 to 1200 BCE, the dates are not entirely clear, there's a period of struggle with the Canaanites. In the Hebrew Bible, it's painted as a conquest of Canaan, as a military struggle. It may have been a little bit more complicated than that. We do know that the Hebrews adopted a Canaanite dialect and the Canaanite alphabet, and that there was some influence between the Hebrews and the Canaanites. There was intermarriage, and the Hebrews worshipped Canaanite gods. You do see this discussed in the Bible. Okay, so again, the idea of the conquest of Canaan in 1300 BCE, of the Hebrews taking over the land of Canaan and conquering the Canaanites, may be a little bit more complicated. There was definitely a period of mutual influence between the Canaanites and the Hebrews. However, the threat of the Philistines forced the Hebrews to unify, forced the 12 tribes to unify under a united monarchy and wage war against the Philistines. Now, by the way, it's sometimes thought that the Philistines may have been the same people who invaded Egypt, the Sea Peoples. So only in the face of danger did the Hebrews unite and choose a king. There were two parts to this kingdom, Israel and Judea. So Israel is the northern state. This was actually the wealthier part, and then the south at Judea. So the first king of Israel was King Saul, but the golden age of Israel was under King David and King Solomon. King David was a shepherd boy chosen by God as King Saul's successor, who, according to the Hebrew Bible, killed a Philistine Goliath with a slingshot. David, it was the high point of the Hebrew state, of the Hebrew imperialism, was under King David. David built a permanent temple to Yahweh at Jerusalem, where he enshrined the Ark of the Covenant. He also built a series of military fortifications. And this temple would be completed under his successor, Solomon. It was very much, Jerusalem was very much a capital of a flourishing, wealthy empire, very much a trade center of various luxury goods. But we know that because of high taxes and forced labor to pay for all of this, to pay for the building projects and the fortifications, that this fanned the flames of separatism among the tribes. And eventually this united kingdom split into two, into Israel and Judea. So this split would end the age of Hebrew imperialism. This is after the death of King Solomon. So basically what we have is these two Hebrew kingdoms struggling to maintain their independence now with the rise of the Assyrian superpower, the Assyrian military machine with their large armies and terror tactics. Keep in mind that it's not entirely clear that the Hebrews were at this point strict monotheists. There was still struggles to weed out the worship of other gods and Canaanite gods. Okay, so what happens is that with the rise of the new Iron Age empire, the Hebrews would lose their independence. They're going to be swallowed up by the big Iron Age powers. First, Israel will fall, and then Judah will fall. So the 8th century Israeli kings will become caught up in Assyrian politics. First, the kings of Israel will submit to the Assyrian rulers as vassals. So vassals, I gave you this term before, a vassal would be a local ruler who agrees to submit to the ruler of like an imperial overlord, an emperor. But it's definitely not a relationship of equality. The vassal is in the weak position and basically has to pay a very high tax, a very high tribute. So it's sort of a humiliating position. There was a series of rebellions in Israel from 724 to 721, which led to a very fateful moment in the history of the Hebrew state. The conquest of Israel. This led to the Assyrian policy of deportation, okay, the quote-unquote 10 lost tribes of Israel. So what happened is that the Assyrians used this policy of deportation, and in order to, it was a response to a revolt by King Hosea of Israel, who rejected the paying of the high tribute, the high taxes. So in response, the people of Israel would be deported. They would be forcibly resettled in the upper Tigris region and also settled as military colonists on the Iranian frontier. There were some Hebrews who remained in Israel. But the Assyrians also brought in Assyrian people from the east and intermarried them with the remaining Hebrews. And these people became known as the Cimmerians. So the Assyrian ruler who was responsible for this was called Sargon II, naming himself after the other famous Sargon. He deported these 10 lost tribes. And again, this is relating back to these tribes we talked about here. Because he was already dealing with a revolt in Babylon, this is why the king of Israel decided to rebel. The Sargon was facing, at this time, a revolt by the king of Babylon. So the king of Israel, Hosea, thought it would be an opportune time to revolt and resist this tax. But instead, Sargon put down the revolt and deported these people from Israel and brought in Babylonians and Easterners in their place. Again, the idea of deportation is to break the will of a people and literally eradicate them. So these lost tribes, basically the population scattered among the peoples of the Middle East. So after the fall of Israel, Judea would survive precariously as a vassal state. This is a really important factor in the Jewish self-identity, because now, after Israel disappears, after it's gone, the torch is passed to Judea as the leader of the Hebrews. And again, traditionally, it was Israel that was the wealthier state. And the kings of Judah, after the fall of Israel, kings Hezekiah and Josiah became very aggressive promoters of strict monotheism, that we have to honor the covenant, that we have to, keep up the covenant with Yahweh, and in order to ward off, so that we have a special favor of God and to avoid conquest. But later, Judea too would fall prey to the next big power, the Babylonians. We'll talk about this Babylonian captivity in just a second. But for now, just keep in mind the Judeans keep their independence a little bit longer. They survive as a vassal state under the Assyrians. Okay, so now let's look at this same area and same era through the lens of the Assyrians, through the Assyrian policy of expansion. Okay, so the Assyrian Empire really began in earnest around 911. Again, their homeland were the lands based around Nineveh and Ashur. And in the period from 911 to 744 BCE, they're more or less expanding in this brown area. In truth, the era of imperial expansion begins in earnest under Tiglath-Pileser. And Tiglath-Pileser would conquer Syria, Palestine, Samaria, and Babylonia. Okay, and his son Sargon took the throne and completed the process by conquering Egypt. And it's also under Sargon that the king of Judea became restless and tried to stage a revolt. So this is exactly what we were talking about in the last slide here, the 10 lost tribes. So again, it's Tiglath-Pileser that really builds up the empire, conquering Syria, Palestine, Samaria, and Babylonia, and he is the one that makes Israel and Judea into vassal states. Okay, now Sargon takes the throne, and he faced the revolt in Israel and enacted the policy of deportation of the 10 lost tribes. So the people of Israel were forcibly resettled, scattered throughout the Middle East. Okay, finally, however, what happens is that the Assyrians' policies of ruthless militarism begin to catch up for them. For the most part, the Assyrians showed little respect for the native traditions and native religion of the areas they conquered. Okay, this is absolutely the opposite of, the Hammurabi style of governance. Hammurabi was Enlil's good shepherd, and he always respected the gods of the lands that he conquered. The Assyrians didn't particularly the Assyrians didn't particularly honor the gods of the lands that they conquered. With one exception, they tended to show special respect for Babylon out of respect or deference to Hammurabi. But for instance, they very much disrespected the Egyptian gods and polytheistic traditions. So after the time of the fall of Israel, the tables begin to turn on the Assyrians, and their days increasingly became to be numbered as their policies of state terror begin to catch up with them. Okay. After Sennacherib became king, another Assyrian ruler, okay, there was a revolt in Babylon, and a local ruler declared himself king, challenging the power of Sennacherib. Okay, this was the revolt of Babylon, and a local ruler called Marduk-apla-iddina becomes king. Look, the names here aren't important. I'm just trying to explain to you what happened and how the Assyrian Empire fell. So Sennacherib became king, and a local ruler claimed to rule in Babylon. Sennacherib will depose Marduk-apla-iddina and puts his own oldest son on the throne to rule personally. Okay, so Sennacherib is putting his son on the throne of Babylon to rule personally and to supervise matters so they can't rebel. However, what happens is that in cahoot with the Elamites, if you remember from the time of Hammurabi, are here. In cahoots with the Elamites, the Babylonians will overthrow Sennacherib's son. So with this Babylonian revolt in 689, the Assyrian Empire was almost toppled. Okay, with the quashing of the Babylonian revolt, the Assyrian Empire will stop its policy of toleration or conciliation with Babylon. As I mentioned to you, traditionally, the Assyrians had special respect for the religion, for the traditions of Babylon. They did not, they let the Babylonians worship their traditional gods. Well, after this Babylonian revolt, they changed their policies. They burnt Babylon and their temples to Marduk to the ground by fire. 689, total and utter destruction, utter devastation of Hammurabi's Babylon. Meanwhile, Sennacherib's son, the one that is ruling on Babylon, is called Esarhaddon. He tries to patch up things with Babylon there as the king there. He does try to rebuild some temples as a means of patching up things with the people. But quickly, the fear and intimidation tactics of the Assyrians are catching up with them and driving the conquered peoples into each other's arms, okay? Because what happens is that although Esarhaddon will temporarily patch up matters, the Assyrians will be thrown over once and for all in 612 BCE. Okay, there's one more thing I want to mention to you. There's also an internal dynastic struggle among the Assyrian kings. So as I mentioned to you, Sennacherib put his eldest son on the throne of Babylon. But what happens is that this bred dynastic struggle. With the older son becoming king of Babylon, they resented the younger brother, who actually ruled back in Ashur. The older brother in Babylon was sick of reporting to the younger brother at the capital, and this contributed to the downfall of the empire. So in the end, the fear and intimidation tactics, like the burning of Babylon, will drive different conquered peoples into each other's arms. So the Babylonians will conspire with the Elamites, and once and for all, in 612, the Assyrian king will be overthrown, and in revenge, they burn Nineveh to the ground. Okay, so finally the Assyrian military machine is gone. We will have the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, it's a period in between the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the next big empire, the Persian Empire. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire would recreate Hammurabi's empire more or less. It's not as extensive as the Assyrian Empire. It would encompass Samaria, Acadia, Syria, and Palestine. It's not as far-flung as the Assyrian Empire. And I'm covering it mainly to finish the story of the Hebrews and the Jews, because this is the last part of that story here. But again, the two conquered peoples of the Assyrians, the Elamites and the Babylonians, conspired together to overthrow these hated kings and to burn their capitals to the ground. So after they overthrow the Assyrians, this is done by a king called Nabopolassar. He announced that he has overthrown the heavy yoke of Ashur. The people conquered by the Assyrians referred to themselves as being under the yoke of Ashur, not a good thing. But in fact, the new government of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was just as repressive, just as bad, and soon would be overthrown by the Persians. The Persians have a very different style of government. Well, let's talk about King Nebuchadnezzar, important to the Jews, important to the city of Babylon. He was a great general. He was also a great builder. He rebuilt Babylon on a grand scale, and focused on defensive city walls. He wanted the city to survive any attack and amaze visitors. That's to say, survive another attack from the likes of the Assyrians. Each and every brick on the city walls was inscribed with his name, with an inscription to the effect of, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who cares for the Esagila and the Azida." There were two sets of defensive walls, an inner set of walls and an outer set of walls, and the outer walls were as thick as 20 feet. The second set of walls that you see here were decorative. Next to the outer walls, there were grates installed over the river to prevent enemies from getting in, like the Assyrian sappers tunneling under the city. Nebuchadnezzar also restored all of the temples, the great ziggurat to Marduk at the center of the city, the statues to Marduk that had been stolen that were made out of gold, and restoring all of the old temples. Nebuchadnezzar was also responsible for the fall of the Judeans. So, as I mentioned to you before, the king of Judah, Judah survived as a vassal state. So Judah is now a vassal state of the Neo-Babylonians. They have to pay a tribute. Beginning in 597, 10 years before here, beginning in 597, the king of Judah refused to pay the tribute to Nebuchadnezzar against the advice of the prophet Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar himself came to Jerusalem while the army was besieging it, and the king of Judah and his family and the nobles were forced to surrender. And at that point, the treasures and the gold of the temple were taken, and all of Jerusalem was carried into exile. 597, all of Jerusalem was carried into exile. So basically, the elite, the kings, and the noble family was carried into exile in Babylon. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, sets up a supposedly loyal ruler in Judah, Zedekiah, but this supposedly loyal ruler also would revolt in 587. So finally, in retaliation, Nebuchadnezzar burns the city of Jerusalem to the ground and took the remaining population to Babylon, where they would stay until 539. So we call this period from 587 to 539 this so-called Babylonian captivity. The population of Judah was sort of held captive within the walls of Babylon. And it's definitely a turning point for the Hebrew people, and now we can speak of as the Jewish people. From this point forward, the Hebrews would be redefined as Jews, which referred not to a geographical location or a nation state, but to this religious identity of being Jews. And this is a crucial period for the Jewish identity and the writing and editing of many of the Hebrew texts. Although many of the books of the Hebrew Bible predate the Babylonian captivity, many important parts of it are finished and edited during this period. In fact, the Jews will be saved when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, who allows them to return to their homeland. But more in that in just a second. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which again was founded by the Babylonians in cahoot with the Elamites against the Assyrian yoke, would also come to a rather ignominious end in 539 BCE. The last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was a religious eccentric called Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was concerned with promoting the cult of the moon god Sin to the exclusion of all other gods and to the ignoring of his other political duties. He moved the capital to an oasis in the desert of Syria and sort of left Babylon sitting. Apparently his mother was from the city of Haran in northern Syria, where the moon god Sin was very popular, and she said that the moon god Sin had visited her in a dream and prophesied that her son would promote this moon god Sin to restore his temple. So Nabonidus moves the capital to this location in Syria and very much angered the priest of Marduk, the whole population of Babylon, who of course honored Marduk. In his third year of rule, he decides to do all this, to move the capital to this desert oasis and promoting the worship of this moon god Sin. So you can think of Nabonidus as a sort of Akhenaten, although on a somewhat smaller scale. He left his son as regent of Babylon, but this moving the capital to the middle of the desert was looked at by the priest of Marduk as a total abandonment, as the religious festivals could not be performed without the aid of the king. So, because of the threat of the new power in the east, the Persians, he returns to Babylon, but he finds that his people had abandoned him. The Babylonians would be welcoming the new invaders, the Persians, as just and good liberators. So overall, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, very short-lived empire, the most important thing here is how it relates to the story of the Jews being held within the walls of Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so the second of the Iron Age superpowers that we'll be examining that comes to power after the fall of the Neo-Babylonians would be the Persians. Okay, so the Persian Empire is the world's largest empire and is the other great Iron Age power. The Persians are based in the southern part of what is now Iran, with their capital at Persepolis, and they speak an Indo-European language. So before we examine the specifics of this, let's briefly look at their army, relating back to the idea, the military developments that we looked at. The Persian army was a typical Iron Age army, and it would be the largest army yet as well. It was about 250,000 men. And they tended to rely on speed and mobility. And as such, the infantrymen tended to be lightly armed. They tended to use wicker shields and very light body armor. The Greeks would be later sort of confused by this, wonder why the Persians went into battle essentially wearing little more than t-shirts and these wicker spears. But they essentially they favored mobility and speed. They would use in their very large infantry shield bearers, spearmen, and archers. Very well known for their archers and their cavalry forces. The elite of the army was the so-called 10,000 Immortals, an elite corps of 10,000 infantrymen whose number was never allowed to fall below 1,000. If any soldier died or was incapacitated, a backup would be immediately there to replace him. But again, it's another Iron Age army with a cavalry, with the example from the Assyrians of using single horse archers again. So large army. Okay, traditionally the Persians are the lesser power in this area of the world. The Medes, based at Ecbatana, were the traditionally more dominant power in what is now Iran. Originally, the Persians are vassals of the Medes. Originally, the Persians served the Medes. They are inferior to the Medes, but this relationship will be reversed. So our theme is how the Persians come to power and they will be welcome as liberators in these areas that the Neo-Babylonians had conquered, and most importantly in Babylon, to the Babylonians and also to the Jews being held captive there. So the Persians are the new power in the region. Originally, the Medes are dominant. The great figure in the Persian Empire, the liberator of the Babylonians and the Jews, is Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, the story of his life is a classic tale about these children of noble birth who are wrongly disinherited and return to claim the throne. We'll see these often. So according to Herodotus, he was the grandson of the Median king Ashtanges, and was brought up by a humble father. After the birth of Cyrus, Ashtanges had a dream that his grandson would overthrow him. So his grandson was Cyrus, and the grandfather was Ashtanges, the king of the Medes. And Ashtanges dreams that his grandson Cyrus would kill him and overthrow him. So to prevent this, Ashtanges ordered a servant to do it, but unable to do this, to murder this young child, the servant hands him over to a herdsman. Now, basically, I need to emphasize to you, Cyrus is of mixed heritage. His mother was a Median princess. His mother was the daughter of Ashtanges, and his father was Persian. So that's how he is Persian yet related to the Median king. So he would be raised by a shepherd and his wife, but was the legitimate child of this Median royal princess, the daughter of Ashtanges. And again, supposedly Ashtanges ordered that the infant be killed, but he was saved and found by a shepherd. Likely, the story was exaggerated. So likely the story of his mixed inheritance was true, but it was likely exaggerated to provide him with a legitimate pretext for conquering the Medes. He would also marry a Median princess to justify his conquest. So the career of Cyrus begins in 550 when he conquers the Medes, when he overthrows Ashtanges, who happened to also be his grandfather. So Cyrus goes from being a vassal to ruler. Yet instead of enslaving the Medes, and again, the Persians are related to the Medes, they accept the Medes as cousins and equals and incorporates them into his army. So this is a pattern that the Persians would do again and again. They build an empire based on loyal subjects, on relationships of equality rather than fear. So Cyrus would create this huge empire from basically India to Palestine based on toleration and accommodation. Next, he would overthrow the king of Lydia. Lydia was a kingdom established in Asia Minor after the fall of the after the fall of the Hittite Empire, pardon me. And we know that the Lydian kingdom was very, very rich. Their king, Croesus, if you say someone is as wealthy as Croesus, that means they're very rich. But he overthrows the Lydians, but again, accepts them as equals in the empire, offers them the chance to serve in the army. Definitely a turning point would be 539, when he is welcomed as a just conqueror of Babylon. And definitely do read the primary text carefully. In 539, he rides into Babylon, and he's very clever. He refers to the offenses of Nabonidus, who had angered Marduk, and that he, Cyrus, was restoring everything that Nabonidus had offended by honoring only this moon god Sin. According to inscriptions, he says Marduk had searched for a just ruler and had ordered Cyrus to go to Babylon. So that's very interesting. Cyrus conquers not in the name of the Persian gods, but in the name of the Babylonian gods. So Cyrus would be welcomed as a hero and a liberator who would overthrow the Neo-Babylonian, the religious eccentric Nabonidus. speaking to his status as a benevolent ruler, as a good ruler, he would restore the Jews, free them from the Babylonian captivity, and allow them to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple. He would die on campaign, but he would be succeeded by his son, and he actually gives them the Jews some fund for the restoration of the temple. He would be succeeded by his son Cambyses, who took up the project of Cyrus of conquering the empire, and particularly conquering Egypt. So Cambyses pushes into Egypt and Kush, Sudan, and also into the Indus Valley. I must say Egypt is the one exception where the Persians were not so tolerant. Cambyses did not like the Egyptian polytheistic religion, and Cambyses destroys depictions of gods in human form. He destroys mummies, he violates tombs. So there they behaved a bit differently. And in response, Egypt would rebel constantly. Okay, so yes. Now his son, Darius, would be responsible. So the first two Persian rulers, Cambyses and Cyrus, would be responsible for the military conquest of this empire, but it would be up to Darius to sort of administer and organize the empire. And one reason for the Persian Empire's success was its system of organization. So Darius established a system of satrapies. Satrapies were governors of the various areas of the empire, and essentially they were supposed to be the eyes and ears through the king. Sometimes the satraps were local rulers, local elites, and sometimes they were members of the imperial family. So there's a flexibility there. As long as the local rulers were loyal, they left them in place. They constructed this fantastic, sort of unprecedented royal road to help provide for communication in the empire, with way stations and forts, and supposedly you could ride from Susa to Sardis in 3 weeks. In addition to this, they established a system for common coinage and used as a principle of tolerance the most common language within the empire, which happened to be Aramaic. So the point is that they adapt the most common language rather than imposing Persian on the empire. And of course, undergirding all of this was their policy of religious toleration. Largely, they faced very few rebellions and allowed the people under the empires to have some autonomy as long as they paid the taxes. And again, in exchange for paying the taxes, they were guaranteed religious and cultural freedom. So if you look in the source book, I think we see these attitudes very clearly in Cyrus the Great's ruling the empire. If you read the first sentence of it, I'm on page 28 on the primary source, he says, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer, king of Akkad, king of the Four Rings, king of Cambyses, great king, king of Ashan, grandson of Cyrus, great king, king of Ashan, descendant of Thespes, great king, king of Ashan, of a family which always exercise kinship, whom Bel and Nabu love, whom they want as king to please their hearts." So already he's referring not to the Persian gods, but to the Babylonian gods. If you continue on page 29, "When I entered Babylon as a friend, and I established the seat of government in the palace of the ruler under jubilation and rejoicing, Marduk, the great Lord, and the magnanimous inhabitants of Babylon, and I was daily endeavoring to worship him." So essentially, you read carefully, you see how he presents himself as a just ruler. I want to mention to you guys that I've posted an extra video, which is optional for you to watch, which I think you may find very interesting, which deals with different types of archaeological evidence relating to the Hebrew story. So this is entirely optional for you to watch, but you may enjoy it for your own enrichment. Thank you.